9:30. Let's get the latest in New Science from New Scientist magazine. Janine Young representing in Melbourne today. Welcome back to the show, Janine.
Good morning.
And today we're talking about the evolution of the human brain, and new research suggests that the human brain didn't evolve for things like rationality or right or wrong, but for very different reasons.
Absolutely. We like to think of ourselves as being rational, logical creatures, that human thinking is all about critical reasoning and that we make decisions based on the evidence in front of us. Rubbish. We aren't. We're totally irrational creatures in many ways. There is much fuzzy logic, if you like, that influences a lot of the decisions we make. We can be presented with something in front of us that is in fact the best for us, but we will go for something completely different. And it's for a long time been very difficult to be able to reconcile these sorts of decisions and this fuzzy logic and the irrationality with the idea that we have evolved to be critical, rational human beings. We're not. Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber from a couple of universities in Europe, one in Switzerland, the other in Budapest, have come up with the idea that our brains have actually evolved to argue and to persuade, which is an interesting idea because when you think about a lot of the sorts of biases and problems that we experience, it actually makes a fair amount of sense. The most persuasive, I should say, lines of reasoning are not always the most logical, but they can be the ones that can help you win an argument or win people over to your point of view. It can sometimes also be the ones that are the easiest to justify our actions. And when you are being asked to justify your actions, you will occasionally do things that aren't in your best interest, shall we say. Look at several mobile phone contracts. What did we do that for? There you go.
True.
The flip side of all of this is that there's also potentially a healthy skepticism that came in that means you can see the faults in others' logic. So when human communication came along, of course, you're going to have to interact with others, and if you wanted to try and get your point of view across, then you were going to have to persuade people. You're going to have to debate, discuss, and argue. Face it, we all argue. We all do it. It's one of those things that whether or not we want to, it's our way of getting our way. And so the idea that you can take something like the confirmation bias, which is something we do all the time, and most of the time we're not even aware we're doing it, because we think, no, I'm objective, I can do this. The confirmation bias is when you seek out evidence that supports your own point of view. It could be political, it could be your opinions on genetically modified crops. It could be anything at all, and it doesn't even have to be the heavy-duty stuff. If you take the idea that we evolved to be argumentative, then what it means is that we're not going to waste time looking for evidence that doesn't support our point of view.
Yeah.
For a long time, psychologists have been saying this doesn't make any sense, why do we do it? There's now a potential answer for why this has happened. Making decisions that aren't necessarily the best for us are often the ones that are the easiest to justify. How questions are framed or evidence is framed or whatever will change the way we look at it. And so it seems that if you're being asked to justify it, then the decision you make is going to be potentially quite different from the one that if you were being rational and objective and logical, it's completely different. It's a really interesting idea to think that over time we were trying to persuade others, but then also trying to pick holes in others' arguments. It's a different way of looking at things, and to many psychologists, they think this is one of the most important pieces of work that's come through in many, many years.
Wow, really? That's significant. That's amazing.
There is a psychologist that has said that the abstract of this paper should be put in the photocopying room of every psychology department in the world. This is also the same man that believes that our moral judgments are not the results of rational thought. It's actually all about gut reactions. Now, to me, this doesn't make any kind of surprise. This is just sensible. Of course it's going to be a gut reaction. I don't think we're rational creatures anyway. We can try it, but I don't think we are. So he thinks that this is great because it dovetails very neatly with his research. But a number of others are a little more sceptical. They're thinking that perhaps our ability to argue was a secondary process instead of being the primary one that drove the way we go. But the big benefit of all of this is group thinking. The results that people come up with in a group setting are 9 times out of 10 better than what they'll come up with on their own. There's a test, several experiments have been done, that if they fail this particular test, as soon as they get into a group with 5 or 6 others, even if everyone in that group has failed the test beforehand, they will invariably come up with the correct logical answer when they do it together. Children learn and respond to ideas a lot better in group situations when they're doing it together. And that doesn't mean that you've got necessarily one person imposing their point of view onto the group and therefore that's the way it works. It's all about debate and all about trying to put ideas across and the like. The corollary of that, of course, is groupthink. I'm sure a lot of people have heard of that idea, where you end up with disastrous decisions coming out of a whole bunch of people that have the same ideological points of view, dismiss or stifle dissent, and we come up with some pretty awful, massive decisions. Vietnam War, Iraq invasion, anybody?
Yeah, true. Well, that's some interesting research there. We'll move on from that, though, and look at what the heck we're going to do with all this radioactive waste. Well, not here in New Zealand, of course, being nuclear free, but over the past 60, 70 years, that has been the conundrum, what to do with it. Could particle accelerators be part of the solution?
Potentially, yes. As you say, the amount of nuclear waste is absolutely extraordinary. Global stockpiles are growing by more than 10,000 tonnes each year. They're staggering numbers. So, of course, the nasties that come out of that are really very difficult to deal with. Some of them have half-lives that are thousands and thousands of years. What do you do with them? The idea is being able to use a particle accelerator to generate a whole bunch of neutrons to hit the nasties. Now, the way nuclear energy works is that you have uranium, it gets hit by a neutron, it falls apart. That's the simple way of putting it. What it does is generates more neutrons that then hits the one next to it, so it generates a chain reaction. What it also does in the meantime, though, is that some of the uranium absorbs neutrons and develops things like plutonium and neptunium, americium. I've got to say that's one of the potentially worst named elements on the periodic table.
Isn't it?
Who thought of that one?
Yeah.
Terrible. Hard to say. But it's these very heavy actinides that are really difficult to deal with. So the idea is that if you can hit them hard enough with these neutrons, what they do is that they fall apart. And so that means that they go into different elements like krypton-85 or cesium-137 that have half-lives of 11 and 30 years respectively, instead of tens or hundreds of thousands of years. So it means that, yes, you still have radioactive waste, but it's not as hard to deal with, and it also means that it's not as radioactive. Now, the potential benefit of being able to use a particle accelerator is that it will also generate energy. If you use thorium as the energy source instead of uranium, what's the point of using uranium and just end up with more plutonium? Thorium is 2 to 3 times as abundant as uranium. All of it is used as a fuel, and there's no chain reaction in the same way as there is for uranium. So it's potentially a much better source of fuel anyway. Just a side issue, it was being explored when nuclear energy was originally being developed, but it didn't produce plutonium, and you can't use that as a weapons-grade material.
Oh, God. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Anyway, there you go. There's your nice little conspiracy theory for the day.
Yeah.
But it's a 2-step process, which means that there's no chain reaction. So even though you'd need a whole new infrastructure, you'd need a lot of different types of things, you'd need different particle accelerators, you'd need different processes than we have now. Potentially, it could be a really positive way of being able to deal with the waste that we have, because it would be generating energy, getting rid of waste, and removing a whole bunch of problems that currently very few people know how to deal with, because reprocessing of nuclear waste is expensive and no one wants to do it. No one wants to transport it. No one wants to bury it. No one knows what to do with it. So potentially being able to break it down using neutrons, maybe not such a bad idea.
Not such a bad idea. I tell you what wouldn't be a bad idea is reading those 2 articles even more in depth as well at New Scientist, New Scientist magazine, newscientist.com as well. Janine Young is our correspondent joining us in Melbourne City. Thanks very much for that.
See you next week.
Got a track now from